Greetings. Last time we looked at Immaculate Conception, the circumstances surrounding Mary's parents. Today we're going to look at the symbols of the Immaculate, symbols of the mysteries, of the Immaculate Conception. So that's the subtext. I saw the whole earth parched and dried up. I saw Elijah with 2 servants climbing up Mount Carmel. They first crossed a high ridge. Then they went up steps cut in the rock to a terrace. From this terrace, they ascended by similar steps to a level place from which arose a hill. The hill contained a cave, and up to this Elijah mounted alone. He left his servants on the border of the level place, that they might look down upon the Sea of Galilee. Its waters were dried up, and its bed lay full of holes, mud, and putrefied carcasses. Elijah sat down, his head resting upon his knees, covered himself with his mantle, and prayed earnestly to God. 7 times did he call to his servants as to whether no cloud of the sea had yet risen. At last I saw the middle of the sea, a white vapor, out of which came a black cloud. In the latter was a small shining figure which, rising on high, gradually increased in size. As the cloud rose, Elijah perceived in it the figure of a radiant virgin. Her head was surrounded by rays. Her arms were outstretched in the form of a cross, one hand clasping a victor's wreath, and her long garments fell as if bound below her feet. She appeared to be hovering over Palestine. In this vision, Elijah learned 4 mysteries relative to the Blessed Virgin. One was that she would come in the 7th age, and another was the family to which she should belong. He also saw on one shore of the sea a low spreading tree, and on the other a very lofty one, whose summit drooped over the lower one. I saw the cloud break up and fall in fleecy vapors upon certain holy places, and upon the abodes of certain pious people who were in prayer. These vapors were bordered by rainbow edges, and in them was the blessing like a pearl in its shell. I was told that this, though typical, was a true representation of how the preparation of the coming of the Blessed Virgin would develop from various blessed points. Soon after this vision, Elijah enlarged the cave in which he was accustomed to pray. He made new regulations for the prophet children, of whom from that time some in that cave constantly supplicated for the coming of Mary and honored her advent. Elijah had by this prayer called up the clouds, and he directed them according to interior enlightenment. Otherwise, a sudden and destructive rain gust might have resulted from them. At first I saw these clouds dropping down dew, settling in white plains, forming eddies with rainbow-colored edges, and finally dissolving in drops. I recognized some connection between them and the manna in the desert, which in the morning lay brittle and thick like a skin upon the ground. It could be gathered in rolls. I saw the vapors floating along the Jordan. They did not fall in all places indiscriminately, but only here and there, at Salem, for instance, where John baptized at a later period, and at the spot where subsequently his pool of baptism stood. I asked for the signification of the colored edges, and it was explained to me by a certain shell of the sea which, too, has shining colored margins. The shell under the sun's rays absorbs the light, reflects its colors at the edges, thus purifying the ray as it were, until its own center, the pure, white pearl, is formed. I cannot express it, but I understood that that dew and the rain following it did more than what is commonly signified by a refreshing, a watering of the earth. I received the clear assurance that without this dew, Mary's advent would have been delayed 100 years longer, while through that watering and blessing of the earth, the different families living in the produce were quickened and enlivened. Thus, their flesh received a new blessing by which it became more purified and ennobled by propagation. The vision of the pearl in its shell bore reference to Jesus and Mary. The drought that I saw was not confined to the earth alone. There was also a great drought, great sterility among men. But the spray of the fructifying dew descended from generation to generation down to the flesh of Mary. I cannot express it. At times there appeared upon the colored edges of the cloud one or several pearls, and upon these a human figure, breathing forth something spirit-like, which again seemed to amalgamate in the others. I saw also that, by the great mercy of God, the pious pagans of that age knew that the Messiah would be born of a virgin of Judea. This knowledge was imparted by the star worshippers of Chaldea, by the appearance of a vision either in the star or in the heavens. They prophesied concerning it. I saw the same tidings of salvation proclaimed in Egypt. Elijah was commanded by God to bring together into Judea several pious families scattered to the north, east, and south. He sought for 3 prophet scholars suited to the mission, and he implored a sign from God by which he might recognize them. For it was a distant and very hazardous undertaking. One went north, the second east, and the third south. This last route led to Egypt, where Israelites could not enter without risk. I saw the third messenger journeying along the road subsequently traversed by the Holy Family, and also at Heliopolis. He came at last to a great pagan temple surrounded by numerous buildings and situated in a wide plain. A live bull was worshipped in this temple, and in it were also the image of a bull and other idols. Deformed children were sacrificed to the animal. As the prophet was passing the temple, he was seized and led before the priest. Fortunately for him, they were exceedingly inquisitive, else perhaps they would have murdered him at once. They questioned him as to whence he came. He answered fearlessly, telling them that a virgin would be born from whom should proceed the salvation of the world. Then would all their idols be shattered. They were amazed and impressed by what they had heard, and allowed him to go on his way. But they afterward took counsel together and resolved to make the image of a virgin. When it was finished, they placed it high in the center of the temple roof, and in a position as if in the act of floating down. The virgin's headdress was like that of so many of the other idols, half women, half lion, that were in the temple. The upper part of the arms was close to the body, and the forearms extended as if warding off something. Feathers radiated from both upper and lower arms, 2 clasping together like crests or combs. Similar feathers ran down the sides and the middle of the body to the tiny feet. The Egyptians honored this image and offered sacrifice to it, and thereby the virgin might not destroy their god Apis or their other idols. But they still continued in their usual abominations. The only change the prophet's communication wrought was that they thenceforth invoked the image of the virgin and honored it according to the various interpretation they put upon his words. I saw much of the history of Tobias and the marriage brought about by the angel between young Tobias and Sara. The latter was a type of Saint Anne. The old Tobias represented the race of the pious Jews that yearned after the Messiah. His blindness signified that he was to be the father of no more children, and that he would devote himself entirely to meditation and prayer. His quarrelsome wife was an image of the vain and troublesome ceremonies of the Pharisaical doctors of the law. The swallow, a messenger of spring, heralded the coming salvation. Tobias's blindness chiefly betokened the faithful, though obscure, waiting and longing for salvation and the ignorance of whence it should come. The angel had indeed spoken truly when he said that he was Azarias, the son of Ananias. For this word signifies help of the Lord out of the cloud of the Lord. The angel was the guide of the races, the protector and administrator of the blessing, even on to the conception of the Blessed Virgin. In the prayer offered together by young Tobias and Sara, and which I saw carried by angels to the throne of God where it was favorably received, I recognized the supplications of the pious Israelites and the daughters of Zion for the coming of the Savior, also the simultaneous prayers of Joachim and Anne for the child promised to them. The blindness of Tobias and the reproaches of his wife signified also the contempt shown to Joachim and the slighting of his offerings. The 7 murdered husbands of Sara represented those among the ancestors of Mary who had placed obstacles to her coming and consequently to the salvation of man. They likewise denoted to suitors dismissed by Anne before her marriage with Joachim. The reproaches of Sarah's maids signified the derision of pagans, of unbelievers, and of godless Jews upon the delay in which the coming of the long looked for Messiah. Such impious taunts drove the pious to still more earnest prayer. It was also and very particularly a symbol of the scorn that Anne endured from her maid, at which being confused, she had recourse to prayer with so great earnestness that she was heard. The fish about to devour the young Tobias typified the prolonged sterility of Anne, but the removal of its heart, liver, and gall denoted good works and mortification. The little kid brought home by Tobias's wife as the wages of her work was really a stolen one that the people had given to her cheap. Tobias knew the people as well as the whole transaction, and that was the reason that they despised him. It bore also some signification to the relations that existed between the pious Jews and the Essenes on the one hand, and the Pharisees and merely ceremonious Jews on the other. Also the scorn felt by the latter for the former. But what that signification was I cannot now recall. The gall by which the blind Tobias was restored to sight symbolized the suffering and bitterness by which the elect among the Jews arrived at the knowledge of salvation and attained to a participation in the same. It signified the entrance of light into darkness, Jesus entering upon the bitter passion from his very birth. Subtext: symbolical vision. I saw a slender pillar arise out of the earth. It was like the stalk of a flower and like the calyx or the capsule of the poppy. I saw the octagonal church upon the top of this pillar. The pillar arose through the center of the church, and there, like a tree, divided into several branches. Upon these branches stood the members of the Holy Family and their relatives. They were indeed the central objects of veneration in this vision. They stood as if on the stamens of flowers, and stood above between two holy men, Joachim and her father, or some other member of her family. Below St. Anne's breast, I saw a significant space almost in the shape of a heart. In this light, I saw the figure of a shining child unfolding, as it were, becoming larger. Its hands were clasped upon its breast, its head inclined, and it constantly shed toward one quarter of the globe numerous rays of light. I noticed with surprise that the rays did not stream in all directions. On the surrounding branches and inclining toward this middle one were adorers, and all around in the church, in groups and choirs innumerable, were saints inclining in prayer toward the holy central point. The sweetness, fervor, and simplicity of this sacred service can be compared to nothing but a flowery field swayed toward the sun by a gentle breeze, and sending its perfumes and colors to those beams to which all flowers owe their gifts, yes, their existence itself. Above this picture of the Immaculate Conception arose the stem of grace. It extended above Anne, and upon the stem, crown-like, sat Mary and Joseph. Below them, in adoration, sat Anne, but above them all, on the very summit of the tree, sat the child Jesus in unfading splendor, the imperial globe in his hand. In adoration around these groups were first the choirs of the apostles and disciples, and in more distant circles those of the other saints. High above all, I saw in the brightest light figures and powers of indeterminate form, and over them something like a half-sun rayed out its beams. The second picture seemed to signify the Advent. First, I saw the region below and around the pillar. Then I saw the church and its adorers, and lastly the child developing in the shining heart. I received at the same time an unspeakable assurance of the sinless conception. I read it plainly as if in a book, and I comprehended it. I was also informed that a church once stood on this spot, but on account of its being the scene of many scandalous disputes on the subject of the Immaculate Conception, it had been given over to destruction. The church triumphant, however, still celebrates the festival on its site. I heard also the words, "Every vision contains some mystery until its fulfillment." End of reading. Okay, so I have a lot of notes because this reading was a lot of symbols and stuff like that. So let's get into them. I'll try to get to them quickly, but I'm not going to. One, first vision. Elijah is the Old Testament prophet that opposes Jezebel, the priestess of Baal, who was murdering prophets. He was basically on the run from her. What do they call that? On the sly, or is that, I don't remember. Anyways, he went to Mount Horeb, which we know is on the what they call the Sinai Peninsula, between the Red Sea and Saudi Arabia, and Mount Carmel, which was west, near the Mediterranean Sea, west of Palestine, directly west of Lake Capernaum. And around the lake, that's where Jesus' ministry, much of it took place. So anyways, which are the places of the Essenes, if we recall from a few readings ago. And so we must assume that the Essenes had an intimate relationship with Elijah's legacy. Elijah is a powerful part of the Old Testament because we see him here taking on, that is opposing a false trinity, the King Ahab, the false prophetess, the priestess of Baal, Jezebel, and the followers of Baal, which were their children. And this trope is so repeated in history and quite powerfully relevant in our times, where our great prophet of this era is secularism, which is brought on by Freemasonic revolts, and has revolted itself into power into pretty much every major nation, every nation at least. France, the French Revolution was basically the first. It effectively destroyed every monarchy, and each nation's citizens now tries to marry secularism with religion, sort of like a Stockholm Syndrome effect of our time. Or they just use it to outright, and if they're honest, to outright destroy religion, and they call this destruction, the movement of it, the quote-unquote Enlightenment. Okay, so we need a great prophet in our times to destroy this false prophet. Next note, Jesus says it is a spirit that gives life, the flesh is useless. And I repeat that because it's among the things so forgotten in our time. People seek fulfillment in the flesh more than they ever did. Like we make a religion out of the pursuit of happiness. They're so nominal, so in the flesh, so absorbed by this world, that they not only make poor churchgoers, they make poor idolaters, because they have so little commitment to the subject of eternity altogether. They are people, quote unquote, of the world. Even the demons don't really want to use them because they just suck at what they do. Like you're putting together a sports team, you need talent, and these people have no talent or skill. They're like husks. They're useless. They say there's this distinction called the useful idiot. Well, these people are useless idiots. So when I saw the drought as described in the vision of Elijah, the drought of Lake Capernaum, even though it symbolizes the lack of faith in Israel as a whole because they were tormented by Baal idolaters, it reminds me of our times where we experience a drought of faith. How little faith God must find in the world in our time, where people are so intellectually tepid on the subject of spirituality. So they'll search for knowledge of the stars, peoples of the past, of peoples of the present, of different cultures of the world, of languages they speak, of rocket science, biology, chemistry, physics, and so on and so forth. But as soon as you start talking about angels and demons and miracles, they are revolted and believe that you're stuck in the superstitions of the past because you've not been baptized by the Enlightenment. But the truth is that they're children of this world. They're like the children of Baal in the time of prophet Elijah. And you're a child, hopefully, of truth, because the Spirit is truth. Next note, in that time of spiritual drought, we were given one of the most faithful men in history, the prophet Elijah. I wonder if it was like that around the time of the ministry of John the Baptist as well, which is why he got compared actually actively in one of the Gospels to the prophet Elijah, or at least one of the Gospels, because he was of great faith. Certainly, we have to have Elijahs in this world, just men of great faith. Next note, this word she looks for is, she says rainbow colored. It's iridescent. It has that quality of reflecting multiple shades of light because we know how rainbows are formed. Anyways, the iridescence of the mother of pearl is what she's describing, where I think Jesus is kind of like the pearl and Mary represents that beautiful shell that it's found in, or that forms around it. To better understand this metaphor, you can do a bit of reading on nacre and how mother of pearl and pearl are formed. And in these mysteries, you find new ways that God communicates to us through his authorship. It's actually quite fascinating. We know that creation itself testifies on behalf of its creator. Next note, Tobit. I don't know if the Tobit reference was written wrong. However, let me get this straightened out. Tobit was a very righteous man that lived among, I think, the Chaldeans and the Babylonians during the exile. And they were persecuted, and the exile occurred around 500 BC. And they were persecuting Jews. And so Tobit, I think, and I'm basing this off of memory, would go find their corpses near the walls of their cities where they had tossed them off the sides of their cities. And he would give these corpses a proper burial so that they weren't just carry-on food. In doing so, however, this is also where the birds pooped, or this poop splashed in his eye, and it caused him to have white film on his eyes and go blind. I think. Yeah, it's weird. Maybe I heard that wrong or read that wrong. But anyways, and I've read this book recently, but you never remember all the details. Tobit had a son named Tobias, whom he sent on a journey to deliver something to a relative. I don't know if he was asking for help, or I don't remember what it was, but it was in the context of that. He was communicating to a relative and he sent his son Tobias. Maybe he was asking for help. I don't know. Tobias found the angel on his journey, the Azariah, and she describes the what those words mean. But she doesn't name the angel. The angel revealed himself to be Saint Raphael, which is the only instance we actually read about him in the whole Bible. And I liken Saint Raphael to the consoler through the sorrows. But his name means, and he's the healer archangel, his name means God heals. Tobias was not blind. Tobit was. The father, Tobit, was. Tobias was a son. He married Sara because she was tormented by the demon Asmodeus. And so Tobias was told by Saint Raphael to burn part of the fish that warded the demon Asmodeus off so that he would be thrown back into the deserted wilderness. Now, this was done for obviously quite symbolic reasons, and in this text we start to delve into those symbolism. That is because some of Mary's lineage had agents that turned bad, and so extracted from the quote-unquote fish, that is the ancestry, they were burned as if to rebuke the demon that did it, in this case Asmodeus, like God's judgment had come upon them, that they were not going to delay the redemption. You remember the last video, or one of the last two videos, I said that it's almost like Saint Anne and Saint Joachim, through their suffering, merited Mary to be called to be their daughter. So though most babies are 9 months, their conception was 20 years, right? They suffered 20 years of pain to put Mary into this world. So, let's move on. Next note, when I first read the Bible, I really loved the books of Tobit and the book of Judith. I said, the book of Tobit, the book of Judith, I said to my cousin, who was spiritually being courted by a rogue non-denominational Protestants, a group of them, who believed you had to, quote unquote, know with absolute certainty that you're saved. And they tried to, Protestants, they'll cherry pick Bible verses, which poorly read will tell them will say what they want them to say. Poorly understood, that is. So, this goes against Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 1, which essentially says that we never truly know our status with God. Not unless we have beatific vision. We'll know it with the illumination of conscience, if that's a real thing, but that's another thing in itself. And he told me to, quote unquote, be careful with those Catholic Bibles because they add books. Well, it turns out he was lied to. Now, I didn't care, and I still studied in my literature course, I studied the book of Judith in a literature class. I don't remember why, because they kind of sourced it with, to, I think the Celts, or I don't remember whom, but doesn't matter because it didn't originate from them. A lot of people are saying that's a fictional account, but I don't know. But I found out that we know that Tobit is not now, and I don't think Judith was either. But there's other books, Wisdom, Sirach, Maccabees 1 and 2, that were taken out by Protestants, not added in by Catholics. This canon traces back to the documentations from the late 300s, which I have in my thick blue book called Sources of Catholic Dogma. So if Protestants bark about Tobit or Judith, they're actually part of the original canon. And this is sourced in 385 AD, around. I think it was the Council of Rome or something like that. Anyways, but they don't like to know that their Bible was compromised by Martin Luther. They're trying to make Catholics feel like their whole history was a lie. This is a rhetorical method. When you find out the truth, it's quite the opposite. Next note, the Book of Judith is actually another precursor to Mary. She's a beautiful widow who defeats the army surrounding the city. And we see this again in Revelation either 19 or 20. The army surrounds the holy cities. It's when the devils unchained for a little while they gather the whole world to come against the holy city. Where Mary is the new Jerusalem and the new holy city, she will defeat Satan. She is the heel that stomps his head. So the evil king Holofernes tries to take the city, and he gets killed in his sleep by Judith, who uses her beauty to awe him into marrying her before she kills him in his tent. Remember that it is the woman, the mystical city, who defeats the accuser, the unholy city, the red dragon, the ancient serpent. Father Chad Ripperger actually said he was in an exorcist with, I don't remember if he called him Belial in this one, but he admitted that upon seeing the beauty of wisdom, he could never match that beauty, and that's why he had fallen. He was envious. So take that for what you will. Next note. Father Ripperger has great material online, though. I cannot recommend listening to his seminars enough. Next note, remember that also her pilgrim was a Protestant. I don't remember his name. It started with a B. So he may have mixed up the details because he wasn't actually familiar with the Book of Tobit. Again, Tobias was not blind. The father Tobit was. And his blindness was cured by the remedy given to Tobit by St. Raphael. Think of John 9 when St. Peter says to our Lord, and he's talking about the blind person who was born blind. Was he struck blind because of his sins or his parents' sin? And Peter got corrected. Jesus said neither. It was to reveal the glory of God. Jews had this really bad habit of always linking an affliction to a personal accountability. This is an error. Sometimes we're afflicted because God allows demons to afflict us in order to strengthen our faith. We know this when we read about great saints like Saint Padre Pio, who was physically thrashed by demons because it was to strengthen his faith. This is a concept that eluded the Jews. And it's still a concept that eludes many of our time who subscribe to what we can call the prosperity gospel. Last note. At the time of Anne Catherine's writings, only 2 Marian dogmas were declared, whereas now 4 are declared. The 2 at the time were the dogma of the perpetual virginity of Mary and the dogma of Mary being the mother of God. The mother of the Immaculate Conception had not yet been declared by the Church, so Anne Catherine references the ongoing theological argument around her Immaculate Conception. Mystical City of God also talks about those titles. Actually, in Mystical City, you can find clues to not just the 4 that have been declared, but also that she is advocate. She calls her advocate. She calls her mediatrix of all graces. She never calls her co-redemptrix, but she calls her coadjutrix to the redemption, which is essentially the same thing. Now, Saint Bernadette Soubirous, Saint Catherine Labouré, both French seers, helped popularize the devotion of the Immaculate Conception. Labouré, Rue de Bac, being the seer that gave us the miraculous medal, O Mary conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee. That was the 3rd dogma declared, and it was done so in the mid-1800s by Pope Pius IX, I believe. And the 4th, the dogma of the Assumption into heaven, of Mary being assumed into heaven, body and soul, given in the early 1950s by Pope Pius XII. The 5th and final Marian dogma, not declared, pending, and it might be for a while, which people are arguing over right now. Our Lady of all Nations declared that it would be Mary is advocate, co-redemptrix, and mediatrix of all graces, which symbolizes Mary's relationship with all 3 persons of the Trinity. Advocate because she is spouse of the Holy Spirit. Co-redemptrix because she is Jesus' helper or adjutrix, co-adjutrix in the salvation. And mediatrix because she is the princess of the Most High. What was contended back then is the Immaculate Conception, and now people in our time are theologically contending these 3 titles. The current pontiff himself does not believe that Mary is co-redemptrix. You can research this. It is public knowledge. Ave Maria.